Trinity Rep and Providence Public Library present America 2, Reckoning and Resilience. America 2, Reckoning and Resilience marks the 6th year of the America 2 initiative. This 5-part online series combines theater, music, and art with stories from our community and seeks to catalyze community dialogue around the many challenges and potential opportunities of this particular moment. As we confront the aftermath of a polarizing election season, observe a year's anniversary of the arrival of the pandemic in Rhode Island, and reckon with the structural racism and anti-Black violence that continues to rock our communities. Each episode will investigate the impact of the challenges of the past year, with free programming anchored by myself, Director of Community Engagement, Michelle Cruz, conversationalist in residence, Christina Bevilacqua, and resin company member and founder of the Center for Activism and Performance, Joe Wilson Jr. Tonight we kick off with a look back at the origins of the America 2 program and the legacy on which this year's project builds. Subsequent episodes will explore education, health, and activism with a culminating performance for the final event. So let's join Christina Bevilacqua and Joe Wilson Jr. for a conversation about America 2.
Joe, can you go back and talk about, because one of the things I think it's hard to remember is that America 2 at the beginning was I don't think the intention was that it would be an ongoing thing. It was a momentary thing. It was responding to a moment. And can you give a little bit of like a shortened version of the background of how that October moment happened?
The shortened version is I was at a point in my career when I was really beginning to try and ask some really difficult questions of myself around what it meant to be a part of a community and specifically to be a part of a resident acting company. And I was in the midst of that exploration while trying to also, hone my skills as a writer. What is my place as an actor in this community? What are my responsibilities truly? How can I rethink the way I think of myself functioning in this business, but also to try and brush up on my skills as a writer? And so it was suggested to me by our previous and first director of community engagement that I go to a 1-week residency in Ferguson, Missouri that was being sponsored by the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and the 1 Minute Play Festival. It was a 1-week residency in which it was marking the 1-year anniversary of Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson. And we were there with a group of national artists, residents of Ferguson, police officers, community activists, artists, parents, teachers, students, friends of Michael Brown. And over the course of a week, we, through workshops and conversation, we wrote 90 1-minute plays about policing in our communities. And that production ran for 2 nights in St. Louis and in Ferguson. And the original idea was that we would all take these plays back to our home theaters across the country and produce them the following week. Well, I'm happy to say that we were one of the first, if not the first, major regional theater to sign on to this event. And some snafus occurred that the many theaters said that they wouldn't be able to turn around an event like that, but somehow the information didn't get to us. And so we continued planning for an event that the plays hadn't been written. I hadn't been yet. We were inviting an audience, inviting actors to read the plays. We were planning an event based upon as much as I knew, and I hadn't been to Ferguson yet. After that week, later on, right before we went on this trip, we learned that indeed there was a bit of a mix-up, but we'd already planned the event. We'd already sent out the invites, the press releases, people were planning on coming. So, what we did ended up being a bit of a model for the way that these plays were produced subsequently the year after around the rest of the country. And so I literally got off a plane on Sunday from Ferguson with the files, with the methodology in my head about how we did it there. And we produced this event, the Every 20 Hours event that Monday at Trinity Rep. And so that's how that happened. I knew that we had to produce the event again the following year. That was part of the agreement that we made, even though we were a year in advance first, so we produced it again. But I knew that our community demanded and deserved me to expand me, and they deserved me trying to expand this conversation. And so I actually hired Dominic D'Andrea, who is the founder of the Women at Play Festival. I raised money talking to lots of universities. And so that second year, not only did we reproduce the every 20-hour plays, but we added a component called Our Response. And there were workshops that were performed all around the state, led by Dominic. And we wrote our own plays about policing in our communities. And so that was our second year doing it. And then after that, we were in the midst of a presidential election. I kept hearing phrases like "Make America Great Again" and "the American people want" and "the American people demand." And I kept asking myself, what American people are you speaking of? Am I included in that American electorate? And a prompt that we use a lot in the work is this idea of who are we as a community? And so I came up with this idea of calling it America Too, TOO, that I am America Too. We are America Too. And the point was to continue to uplift stories within our community, which can continue to show us who we are and the fullness of who we are. And so the third year that we decided to do this, we focused on immigration. That was around a time when there was a clampdown on DACA recipients. And so the following year, we formed a partnership with Direct Action for Rights and Equality, DARE. And we did a presentation, we did a series of workshops and an evening of presentation of work dealing with the homeless crisis here in Providence. Last year, we teamed up with the Business Innovation Factory and our focus was on healthcare. And this year, this year has been what it is. And there's so much that we're focused on right now. But we felt it was important to re-engage with our community and to use America Too as a platform to be able to do that. And so that's basically a brief history of how we've gotten to this point.
I mean, I remember the first event from the perspective, I mean, I was at meetings to plan it, but I wasn't involved in the planning. I know it was an enormous lift. There was just a huge amount of work but also an incredible amount of excitement. But in terms of the audience response was really, in some ways, even bigger, and just the excitement, people signing up and ending up on a waiting list, people showing up that hadn't registered. There were just tons of people, food trucks, excitement. Can you talk about, I don't even know if you guys were thinking about what the audience piece was going to be because you had so much else, but what did it feel like when you saw the theater just surrounded and filled with so many people?
Well, it was incredible. I think that we always think about our audience experience, or we say we think about our audience's experience when they come into the theater. We think about that experience as soon as they walk into the front doors, whether that be how they're treated by front of house staff, what they're seeing visually. Are we using artists in presentations in the lobby to help amplify and reflect the story that our audience will see on stage, even down to what the lighting is. I mean, we think about these things when producing plays, but I think that it was amplified 10,000 times with this project, because of course we were thinking about audience experience, because we knew folks were coming after work and they had to have food. So we got food trucks. We were thinking about the audience experience because we were rehearsing our plays until the last minute. So we couldn't let them into the house until the very last minute. So what would that be like for them waiting? So we got a band. What would the experience be like? How would we welcome them into the space? The band brought them into the space. But also what was happening inside the room before our audience even came into the space was there was an incredible amount of collaboration and accessibility that our institution was reflecting to those artists who were in that room. Many of those artists maybe had been on our stage once, maybe had never been on our stage. It was a collection of professionals, non-professionals, college kids, housewives, dads. You know, it was not an actor meant, we called actors to come, but anyone interested in reading, anyone interested in taking up space was welcome. So I think that what happened instinctively was the way the institution, the doors literally were thrown open in a way that wasn't as controlled as we like to be in these spaces. There was a lot of stuff that was beyond our control. We literally got information that morning, scripts that morning that we had never read, plays that we couldn't curate. This in a way was an event that was uncuratable. We had to put the pieces in motion and allow it to happen, which is really, in its purest sense, what our theatrical spaces demand of us and one of us. They want us to come in and put ourselves in someone else's shoes. They want us to come in and under the lights and under the sound and the sights of a play, escape and allow ourselves to enter into that play in a very active way. And we are sometimes successful in theater and sometimes we're not. But there was something about this project, and I think it was partly because of the subject matter. I think it was partly because of the interest in, well, what was this thing Joe was going to go off to Ferguson and do? And what do you mean we're coming back on Monday and doing an event that no one's rehearsed, that no one's marketed, that no one knew what was going to happen, but we were coming together to have a very important discussion, and a discussion ultimately that meant something so much to our community. We were truly making a piece of work of, by, and for the community on the spot. They were the actors, they were the stars. We were talking about what we wanted to talk about. And it wasn't curated by an institution in any way, except for providing a space for this conversation to happen. And us spending a fair amount of time thinking about how do we make people feel welcome in our space, feel comfortable in our space, and what can make it attractive for them to show up when they really did not know what was going to happen. And we didn't either. So a part of that, and I don't want to diminish the subject matter, was to make it, we thought about it as an event. And more importantly, we wanted to create a space where people wanted to spend some time for an hour or two and to be engaged in conversation and to be with each other.
So I think about that first moment, that first year with America 2, after I returned in that second week of October. And we had an event and we invited people and we invited actors. We publicized this conversation that we were going to have around art making and policing. And I think the response of our community to that event was something that was unlike anything that we'd ever seen, actually. And I think that that pointed to, I believe, what we're speaking to now, that there was something impulsive, reflexive, and reactionary to that first event. And I think that we're actually in that moment now. And believe it or not, I think this may come shocking to people, but even as artists who we pride ourselves on being impulsive and reflexive and reactionary, I think I've come to understand how much we actually are not when it comes to the institutions that we love. Part of the challenge of this project has always been, for 1 year in particular, we didn't come up with a theme until like a month before. And that was because we were reacting to, all the new restrictions with DACA and because of some other circumstances. And so, but it's interesting how we don't tend to like that kind of reflexive, reactionary mode, even as we produce, because there's certain givens that we have to have when we produce. I mean, it takes a year in advance to getting designs for a play, choose a director, choose the production team, beginning a marketing strategy, and so forth. And so I think that with that first America 2 it taught us a lesson. And I think it's something that we always continue to strive to recreate. But I think in a way, we're being forced to be in that space now, whether we like it or not, because there is no normal. There's no new normal. We don't know what that's going to be. And we can't produce. And so what does it mean to really be in a reflexive space, a space of of having to react and pivot in the moment, day by day, minute by minute. And that's the first thing that really pops into my head when I think about, that first moment that, every 28 hours show happened in that space in October in 2015. And I think of where we're now.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, I mean, one of the things I think was really fascinating was who was in that room. And it was a lot of people who are usually not in that room. And maybe talk a little bit about that. And then I want to ask you also about, I think one of the really powerful things that came up is that audience dealt with that discrepancy itself.
Well, we spend thousands of dollars in theaters and marketing departments, whether that be on Broadway, off Broadway, in the regions, of how to put butts in the seats. We come up with all these matrices or are these all of these plans around, is it what we're producing, how we're producing it, how can we continue to be vital and important and relevant in our communities? And I think that we saw an audience that night that was composed of people who were not only patrons, but people who were formerly folks who felt disenfranchised from the institution, didn't feel welcome in the institution. There was something that looked different for a lot of people because, quite frankly, we had about maybe 100 people that signed up to come and view that event, but over 300 people showed up. And it was amazing to watch both our patrons and watch those folk who maybe came to Trinity for a Project Discovery show to look around them and really be amazed themselves at how much that space looked like Providence. It looked like this country. And what that did for the space was it also invited all of the different ways that we respond to artwork. That I think sometimes we like to control how our audiences respond. There's a way to behave in the theater, which all of that stuff I think comes from systemic white supremacy, honestly. Rules of how we can engage in the theater. And I've done enough theater where I've done stuff from Broadway to off Broadway to Chitlin circuit versus regional theater. And I've watched how different audiences have permission and give themselves permission to engage in being in communion with work they're watching in a theater. And so it was also great to be in a space where people weren't bound by the same kinds of restrictions that they placed on themselves in being in this kind of public space. So it was a dynamic space. It was a space where everyone was being caught off guard, where Trinity didn't sound the same, it didn't look the same, it didn't smell the same, it didn't feel the same. And we basically turned our institution over to the community. And that's what made it special. But I think with that came a lot of responsibility, because once you do an event like this, and once you espouse all the reasons why you're doing these kinds of events, then you have a responsibility to continue these conversations. Because what you don't want is a one-off event. It's not about an event. It's about, I think that moment for Trinity was the beginning of a process. And it was about engaging in our practice as an institution. We have a long way to go. We're in the midst of that work deeply now and continue to be in the midst of that work. But it was the beginning of a moment for us of examining practices and not just striving to put on events for a short-term gain of filling the seats for A Raisin in the Sun, or filling the seats for Radio Golf or Black Odyssey, or whatever that may be, trying to attract more people for the classical work that we do. Just doing an Othello or having a black guy playing King Lear is not going to eradicate and erase the years of levels of distrust that oftentimes exist between institutions like mine and Trinity Rep with the greater community. We are institutions that for a long time, we suck up a lot of resources. We do. And quite frankly, there are people in this community who have been doing this kind of community-driven work way before we got hip to this idea of trying to do work of, by, and for the people that we serve. And so I think it's a fine line between us continuing to become better, us continuing to examine the work that we do and open our doors, but us also not forgetting the fact that there are many institutions, smaller institutions, whether that be non-for-profit theaters, non-for-profit organizations such as DARE, who have been in this community on the ground level within our communities doing the work that we are now stepping into. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not filling a void that doesn't exist. But I think understanding that we're stepping into these spaces not to dictate what should be talked about, not to shape the relationship, but to be present and to listen and to be of service to. In the same way that we are in service to playwrights, or we say we're in service to the playwright, in the same way that actors say they're in service to the characters, theaters have to be in service to the community. And so I think that's all of what made that night special.
Can
And
you
what also made the subsequent years a little bit more difficult to recapture that magic. Because there was something so responsive and so reflexive and so unpredictable about what would happen that given evening.
Yeah, it was very charged, and I think dynamic, the word when you use dynamic, I think that, you really were, it was like an electrifying experience to be in that room, in part because of the unknown sense of what the actors and the performers and everybody, you guys were all juggling all this stuff, but also just the really palpable sense of, again, who was in the room, why they were in the room, why have they not been in the room before. And I think there was it was a really interesting edge of, in the Q&A afterwards, real kind of confrontation, of like, account for why this is the first time we've all been here. And yet also a real sense of a lot at stake on all sides.
Well, it felt like theater was no longer in the abstract.
Mhm.
It was no longer us watching a character, and even this idea that we're trying to when we welcome people to the theater and we want them to put themselves in someone else's shoes, put themselves into the story, and hopefully becoming more empathetic creatures, is we all knew that these stories were real stories by real people who were speaking to their experiences of police brutality and their reflections of watching their community grapple with the challenges being 1 year out of one of the most traumatic experiences I think this country's ever faced. I mean, that the level of what we saw in terms of the militarization of the police force in Ferguson, what we saw in terms of even the fact that that kid's body lie in the street at the end of the summer and bled out for several hours, and his community of young people who sat on the sidewalks with their little legs. Some of them were sitting on curbs and they were just young enough to touch their feet to the street. I mean, it was a traumatic experience for people. So I think there was a knowledge in our community, and people within our community had their own traumatic experiences with our own police who came to that event at Trinity Rep carrying their own experiences. So the fact that these were real stories of real people, I think was something that took our work finally out of this place of, in the end, that's still not me. No, this is who we are. And these people are actually in this room. And there were people in that room who were able to validate the experiences publicly, verbally, openly, of those folk that we were watching on stage, those stories that we were hearing on stage. So there was something about the work that transcended its sort of preciousness, its staidness. No one was given the permission, I think, no one's given the permission in America to just sit back and watch. And that goes even in terms of how we curate these stories. When we go into these communities, and when we were in Ferguson, and there were like 90 or 100 of us artists and community members who were part of these workshops, no one was allowed to be a spectator. I mean, there was one moment when the New York Times was watching us at that first workshop in Ferguson, and even he had to be a part of these workshops. No one could be in the room just simply watching And I think the same dynamic exists for America too. That even though you come as an audience, you're still in communion with 9 out of 10 times people that you usually don't see. And a lot of that, a lot of what drove our audiences were the issues that and the partnerships that we formed over the course of 5 years, whether that be through DARE or whether that be in discussing issues around healthcare, continuing our conversations around policing, which also involve many of our universities and college campuses. And so the subject matter also allows us to attract and bring in uh, uh, um, uh, um, continually new groups of people into the conversation. And I think that's the most exciting thing about this as well. And so every time you come to an event, you're thrown off a bit because you're seeing people who, have a special relationship to a given topic. And more importantly, and I'm going to put it here, it's a free event. And so the fact that you could sit there in your pearls and your diamonds and be right there next to somebody who can't afford to pay the rent is real. That doesn't happen a lot in our audiences, you know? And so access to the work is also a big, I think, thing that we've learned as a theater around the success of the America 2 project.
Well, and I think it's access to all aspects of the theater too, because it's also who's on stage. And there's
right.
not there's an incredible porousness between who's on stage and who's in the audience. Can you talk about, I keep thinking that it was last year too, but last year it didn't happen. It was 2019 the last time, because this was one of the things that got shuttered in the pandemic in 2020. But I know that the year that healthcare was the topic, that this was, there was even more of a kind of workshopping ahead of time. The process has grown year to year. Can you talk a little bit about that year and kind of what happened to kind of build the stories and build the performances, and then who ends up on stage?
Sure. Well, luckily, what's happened year after year is that we've had the great gift of being able to form more and more partnerships. And our theater, Trinity Rep, had a partnership with the Business Innovation Factory, BIF, for a number of years, because of an event that they had used to have at the theater, which was basically an event, a think tank event, with people from all over the country, all over the world, who were using their creative capacity to affect change in their given fields. As those folks at BIF say, it's about the wonderful, careful collisions of things. That it's in those wonderful, unexpected collisions that we find magic, we find solution, we find creative solution, and that kind of creativity being in every aspect of how we function, not just reserved to the creative arts, but in business and best business practices. And so it was a wonderful event. And so BIF wanted to focus on healthcare themselves. And so they talked, I had some meetings with them, and we began a year-long conversation. The conversation that we had in Providence was also a part of a nationwide conversation that BIF put together around healthcare. It was about doing smaller events in satellite cities rather than one big event in Providence. And so the way that we approached that process was I hired 4 very different artists in terms of their pedagogy. Dominic D'Andrea of the Women at Play Festival, Sakil Ross, who is an incredible professor and teacher and dancer, Meg Sullivan, who is the artistic director of the Manton Avenue Project, and Valerie, who is with the Rhode Island Black Storytellers, Val Tutson. They each ran a workshop using their unique pedagogical approaches. Sakil used movement as a way to excavate story. Dominic used his 1-minute play methodology as a way to excavate story. So too did Meg Sullivan, who is not only an incredible and gifted teacher and writer and actor, but also her pedagogy focuses a lot with young people. So that was a way that we could get a young demographic involved in the storytelling. And finally, Val Tutson with the RI Black Storytellers. led a workshop where she used her pedagogy to develop stories. The other great thing about those 4 workshops is we did them in 4 completely different neighborhoods. And so again, trying to find as many access points as possible, because our relationships to these stories are so complicated and so multifaceted, that we really always have strived to provide space for as many voices as possible. And it was really an incredible experience. It seemed like a place that America too, it was an incredible experience because of the artists. It was an incredible experience also because I feel as though we had finally gotten to a place as those of us who planned this event, that I think that people were really beginning to understand and appreciate the value of what this space could provide to people to have these kinds of conversations. Um,
Well, I
because,
think also, 2019, I mean, the polarization in our country has been going on for a long time, but it was definitely like, it was front and center. And I think one of the things when I look back on that night, or those nights, just the mix of who was on the stage, and healthcare is one of those things. I think it certainly there are vagaries in what kind of access you have, but I think one of the things that became really apparent was how fast you can go from a have to a have not, particularly because it's so tied to employment. And once you're a have not, you can also fall further and further from what you have access to. So it was really, really just so powerful. And I think the other piece about what people have come to expect from the series is that the conversation afterward is as much part of the night, so that as you're watching and taking in this really dynamic event, you also then have a chance to reflect with other people who've shared that. And there really are very few places where we get to do that.
well, what's very interesting is even the way that we designed America 2 in 19 with our partnership with the Business Innovation Factory. And I think it's safe for me to say it was also their desire as a business to be able to change the model of this big event they usually had every single year when they invited folks at Trinity all around the country, to have this sort of gathering of folk. And I think what they were realizing is that, they really wanted to find better ways to be embedded in individual communities. And I think also what was important about what they were interrogating and beginning to interrogate publicly was not just talking about healthcare in a general sense, but targeting the effects of this system, for instance, especially on infant mortality rates within the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very important part of what the Business Innovation Factory was investigating and interrogating on their own. And as a matter of fact, post America 2, they launched this initiative around providing support for Black pregnant women in our community to be able to track their health care, provide them with people who can, take them through the process of best practices in pre-labor. And that was a concrete policy that came out of, or a concrete program that came out of the America 2 2019. What's also interesting is that as we talked about all of these things, whether they be, remember, our first year was policing. The second year was policing and our response to policing here in Rhode Island. The third year was immigration. The fourth year was housing, and the fifth year was healthcare. Now, when we think about in the age of COVID, how all of those issues and how we think about those issues, and even how we're thinking about those issues now, about how all of those things are having a profoundly different impact on certain segments of our community are staggering. And so, the idea that we began to have the courage, and I'm going to say the courage to say, the courage to speak truth to power and say, not only are we having a conversation around healthcare, but we are saying to you all that we are aware and we know that the challenges of this particular system are adversely affecting people of color, BIPOC people in our communities at a far more adverse rate. The fact that we're saying that now, the fact that we can say that without being accused of being race baiting, or without saying, well, I don't know about that. Well, it's hard for everybody. I think this pandemic has exposed the 5 years of America too and these problems, and re-expose them in a way that we now understand them in a far more comprehensive way. And we understand the problem as a far more insidious problem. We could actually redo we could redo all 5 themes of America 2 right now and have completely different conversations charged in completely different ways. Because I think that we as a community are finally able to bring things into the room like race and class and sexism and homophobia and the stakes that all of these isms play in everything that we do. And even more so, we're having this discussion internally in our institutions. It's not just Trinity Rep, or it's not just the library, or it's not just GAM, or it's not just any of the theater trying to do these things as a gesture of goodwill towards a community. That we're doing these things actively now because we have come to understand that this work has made us better. This work has challenged us. This work, like COVID, has exposed the inadequacies of the systems that we operate even within the non-for-profit world. Okay, so I think part of the magic of America 2 has been this gradual deconstruction of I don't want to say, I guess, a deconstruction of a system, a way of doing business, even within my non-for-profit institution. This work has had a profound effect on Trinity Rep, and let me be clear in saying that we don't always do this work or do the right thing or move in a more progressive way or an open way willingly. That this has been a challenge and a fight, but it's been the process that has always won out. It has been the people over the past 5 years that we have welcomed, re-welcomed, welcomed once again, newly welcomed to our space, that have continued to push us to be better. And I have a list of names, like the credits of a movie right now running in my head, of all of the artists, all of the elected officials, all the folk who run non-for-profits, who work in city government, that have been a part of this conversation. I can't thank them enough. And all of those relationships, whether we have wanted it to or not, have had an effect on Trinity Rep, have had an effect on me. I think have had an effect on everyone that has come through and continues to come through our doors, who have experienced America 2. But even if they haven't experienced America 2, I hope that in time that they will experience America 2, because Trinity Rep will be different as a result of this work. Trinity Rep will be different as a result of this socio-anthropological work that makes us dig, and uncover. And the title of is resilience. It's that process of continuing to dig and excavate is, I think, a component of that resilience, but that resilience to confront the truth, because without confronting truth, we cannot move forward. We cannot move forward in any kind of sustainable way. So I speak of America 2 as a work in progress. I speak of America 2 at Trinity Rep, and Trinity Rep is a work in progress as well. And both of these entities are continuing to be in a wonderful collision. And that collision is one of embracing the unknown, embracing community involvement, reshaping the model of how we think we should and can produce. Obviously, COVID has done that. It's reshaped everything about how we can access a product or create a product, or what is product, or the importance of product versus product practice versus practice and process. So America 2 has been, and it's funny because, and here we are talking about it when we can do nothing else as a theater. Here we are talking about America 2. And before, the conversation was, can we afford to do America 2? We can't afford not to. What I love about PPL is that you all are a repository of all kinds of stories, of every kind of story. And I think sometimes in the theater, we spend so much time trying to decide what stories people are going to hear. And that decision is based upon, will they come? How many tickets are we going to sell? Will that sell? Will that be popular? Will they like that? And that's not, PPL is, you are a place that holds all story. And I think that theaters and creative institutions are going to have to ask some hard questions about the stories that they tell and their courage to tell different kinds of stories and how they choose to tell stories or not tell stories based upon what they think will be the financial remuneration as a result of them telling these stories. That if there's too much to risk, we won't tell these stories. If we fear that we won't make as much money, oftentimes the rationale around doing X play or Y play is not based upon whether that's a story that needs to be told and must be told.
I just was thinking about some of the pieces that are really foundational to our programming, where we have a really close relationship with the arts and cultural community, and looking at how we get at issues through practice and experience of the arts. Also, we're really working, we have a new strategic plan along with lots of other people, and we're really looking at decentralizing the way we curate. And I think that that is a hallmark of America Too. The idea of connecting to people in the community who connect to people in the community who connect, and it creates this through line of connection and network, and not network in a transactional way, but in a kind of a live wire way. And I think also, when we were doing Context and Conversation together, which was based on the plays on stage, bringing together artists, scholars, and community practitioners. And I think that's another hallmark of America Too, that there are so many different points of view, and it's that variety of points of view that creates the dynamism. So it's, again, I mean, it's funny that we're neighbors and yet we're on Zoom because we still can't be together even though we're neighbors. But that sense of what's near you, what's your community, what you feel connected to, and how important it is right now to, despite all the things we can't do, look at what can we do and how can we continue to connect and create those bonds with one another.
I also love this collaboration because, I think that people take for granted, and I'm going to use this word and I hope it doesn't sound weird, a scholarship. I think people sometimes take for granted the scholarship in the creative community, and, the amount of scholarship that goes into putting on a play. But there's also a lot of scholarship that goes into, when you talk about curating a conversation or being a part of a conversation, and the kinds of people that we speak to, that we're speaking to all kinds of people in all different sort of aspects of a given topic. If it's healthcare, we're speaking to doctors, we're speaking to, insurance companies, we're speaking to government figures, we're speaking to people being affected by these policies. And I think also libraries have that unique capacity as well in terms of the kind of people that walk into the space, that we're all kind of coming there with the sense of scholarship and getting more information, and knowing that that information is sourced in a variety of ways. And I love this even now in the age of when we're actually having to say this, that truth matters. What the facts are matter. And so, it's not just about coming together to have a haphazard conversation about something, but but putting people in a room, putting people in the room that we can all have present a common set of facts, a common set of denominators, does not mean that we still can't have a spirited argument or conversation around best practices. But there's something about partnering with PPL that once again shines a spotlight, I think, on the power and value of information, correct information, all kinds of sources of information. And quite frankly, I've always enjoyed working with you, Christina, because you have really challenged me in my way, in my own work, to ask those kinds of questions. And sometimes a question that I wouldn't have thought about, an unconventional link to something else. You have a really great way of unlocking links that, on the surface, you probably wouldn't have been aware of, but indeed finding this other angle that then unlocks a whole nother set of people, a whole nother community who may be interested in being a part of a conversation. And then what you're doing in the end is you're accumulating a collective mass of people who are engaged in a robust conversation. And to me, that's the power of this relationship, and again, I think the power is also, and for being completely transparent, I know that both of our institutions are engaged actively in trying to reshape the kinds of relationships, the method of the nature of the relationships between ourselves and the community, whether that be through, how we pay artists or how we don't pay artists, or, providing different points of access, thinking about structures in terms of equity and diversity and inclusion. So we're both on very similar tracks, and in terms of this work. And so to me, that's also very, very exciting. I think that the library has a connection to communities that we don't traditionally have those same connections to in the same kind of way, because of the services that the library provides and the access that the library provides. And I think we have something to learn from that, as a non-for-profit institution.
The library contains multitudes, to paraphrase Walt Whitman.
Contains multitudes.
Everybody comes to the library. What do you like? Let's look ahead to the next few of these. What are we going to be presenting and talking about, and make the connection to the rest of the series for us?
The most important parts of America Too are the people, and the conversations that we have around issues. But more importantly, it's about what we make together. We make an event together. We provide a space for people to come and speak. We engage in that practice as we all choose to come to the theater and be in communion with our fellow man, but also we create art. And so I'm really excited that moving forward, not only will we revisit in many ways a lot of the issues that we've talked about over the past few years, but we will continue to engage our community and continue to engage artists in using their craft to respond to the issues of our time. I'm really excited about having the chance to reconnect with many people in the community who have been a part of America Too over the past 5-6 years. I'm really looking forward to re-engaging in conversations around the artists who have been involved in America Too. And what's really exciting about this is every member of our community has gone through so much over the past 5 years. I remember when I was first going to Ferguson, I had just finished the production of Julius Caesar at Trinity Rep, and we had just lost Barbara Meek, our dear friend. And I remember with Barbara, my fondest memories of Barbara is that we'd sit across the street at Bravo, or when it was Empire, or all the incarnations of what it was, after a show, and we'd have a drink, and we'd always, talk about the show, but we always bitch about politics because we both loved to talk about those things. And at the end of at the inauguration a week ago, I literally, and thinking about preparing for our chat today, I went back and looked at all of my pictures, and it kind of put things into perspective for me about, Barbara passing during Caesar, um, us talking about politics and where we were then, right? And then my going to Ferguson, and then the 5 years of my life up until now through what we've all been through. I say that story to say that we've all been through a lot. And I'm really anxious and curious to hear from the people that we have been in communion with, to find out what's going on, how they're doing, how have their lives changed, um, and continuing to have a conversation with people. But more importantly, to really, and I don't know how to say this without it sounding not very articulate, but providing space for these conversations to go wherever they go. People have a lot they want to talk about right now. People are desperate, people are angry, people are hopeful, people are excited, we're energized, we're all kinds of things right now. And so I'm really looking forward to checking back in with people, actually, and more importantly, making new friends. So America 2, as we move forward in these episodes, will be, much like it was before. Of course, we won't be meeting in person, but the spirit of America 2, these shows being about the community, being for the community, having conversations in community, but more importantly, providing spaces for people to create art. Art that is indeed a reflection of where we've been, where we are, and where we hope to be.
And this is the list since we did this show last year. This is the new list of black bodies and white bodies and American bodies since last year. Black lives matter. Lives matter. We matter.
Wake up, everybody, sleeping in bed. No more about thinking, time for thinking ahead. Road screams so up, everybody. Wake up, everybody. Wake up, everybody. Wake up, everybody. Wake up.
Conversation continues tomorrow.
This project is made possible in part by a grant from the Rhode Island Council on the Humanities, an independent affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. The Rhode Island Council for the Humanities seeds, supports, and strengthens public history, cultural heritage, civic education, and community engagement by and for all Rhode Islanders. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities.